Dr. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Geoff Belknap, currently the Keeper of Science and Technology at the National Museum of Scotland, where he moved recently, actually at the end of last year. Previous to this post, he was Head Curator at the National Science and Media Museum at Bradford, where he was the Curator of Photography and Photographic Technology. In 2016, he published From a Photograph, which was part of his postdoctoral research, where he was based at the Universities of Leicester and Harvard. So we really couldn't have found a more authoritative speaker to give us an idea of the challenges facing a photographic curator. And I very much look forward to this glimpse behind the scenes. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to you, Geoff.
Well, thank you so much, Jane, for such a lovely introduction and for welcoming here and inviting me to come and speak to this fantastic audience. I've just had a look through some of the names, and I see some friends among the audience, as well as hopefully some new friends and some new people I can share some of the love that I've had for photographic collections. I will try to be of national repute. I don't promise anything close to that, but what I want to do really is talk through some of the experiences I've had really over the last 5 years, being really privileged to take care of some fantastic photographic collections, and then some insights into that that I can draw around larger questions around photographic history or photographic collections. Let me just see if I can move on. My slides are moving on. Is that right, Jane? Just to double check, you guys are seeing slides move?
Yes, that's fine.
Fantastic. I have some time to talk to you all about some of the great photographic collections that I have had a chance to work with, as well as some of, I guess, the broader challenges and opportunities that come with working with photographic collections. And I think, needless to say, one of the largest challenges really of dealing with any photographic collections is that there isn't any such thing as a singular photographic collection. They are so large, so diverse, so different, so changing over time. And what they do, what they afford for us, is they allow us to tell our own histories. They are, if you can imagine, one of the most important tools for telling the story of our own lives. And as a museum professional, that means I have the opportunity through photography to help connect to really the widest range of audiences, because every single person that comes through a museum that I've worked at or am currently working in will have a relationship to photography in some way or other. Either they have it in their pocket, they use photographs, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, or they might be interested in older analog photographic processes. But I think that's, to me, one of the greatest opportunities of any photographic collection is they are the most flexible and the deepest collections to help connect to our lives. And that poses a really massive challenge, because there isn't, as I said, one type of photographic collection or one type of photographic materiality. And you need to have different tools, techniques, and approaches to try to access all of these different stories. There are many different types of objects in museum collections which seemingly look like they might be completely related to photography, such as the image that, or might look like they have nothing to do with photography, such as the strange looking head that I have on the right-hand side of the screen here, which is from the William Henry Fox Talbot collection, currently in the National Museums of Scotland. And I'll come back to this later, but this tells a really important story, not just about scientific experimentation in the 19th century, but also tells a really important story about Talbot himself and the kind of practices he was interested in, photographic being one of those, or photochemistry being one of those. But the other, I think, really large challenge is that photographs are always in their multiple, or photographic history is always in its multiple. It is never really in its singular. So as an example on the left, which I'll delve much more in detail later in the talk, is a photographic archive, the Daily Herald Photographic Archive, which currently sits at the National Science and Media Museum, which I had the privilege to work in before. So in this talk, for the next kind of 30 or so, 40 minutes, I'm going to talk through some of the range of photographic material that I've had the opportunity to manage and some of the challenges and opportunities that each of those particular types of photographic materials have posed to me as a curator, as a historian, and as someone wanting to communicate those to wide audiences. I'll delve into one example of a very large collection, the Daily Herald collection at NSMM, that I think helps us think differently about what photography is and what it could be and how we define it. And then I'm going to propose a way towards the end that I've been currently trying to utilize to help open up photographic collections to really wide audiences. So briefly, I have had the kind of photographs I'm going to be talking about in this talk come from two institutions primarily from two institutions that I've had the privilege to work at. As Jane said, for 5 years, I worked at the National Science and Media Museum, first as the curator of photography and photographic technology, and later as the head curator. If you haven't visited this museum and you love photography, then you are missing something. It is one of the most important collections in the world for photography and has a wide, deep, and diverse set of collections. It doesn't have just photography, and I think that's a really important point about its photographic collections. It is linked to the other types of collections held in this museum, which include television, early sound and later sound recording technologies, film technologies, and an emerging games technology collection. So really the broad sweep of media collections, and it sits in a much larger set of collections, which is the Science Museum Group's collections. So they have long and deep institutional histories, of which the photography collection plays a really important role, but it is only one role among many other different types of collections. And the other more recent collection that I've started to delve into, really you ask me as many questions about NMS collections as you'd like. I will try to answer them as much as possible. I've only been there since September, and really I have a career's worth of time left to figure out what's in that collection because it's so big and so diverse. But that is as well a really large and diverse photographic collection. I manage the science and technology collections, which is just one of 5 different large collecting areas. That holds the primary bulk of the photographic collections, which, as you'll see, have a wide and diverse and kind of reflective set of collections to the National Science and Media Museum. But both working at both of these institutions really remind me of why I love photography and why I love photographic collections and why I love coming to places like this and being able to talk about them, because they are everywhere. They are really amazing collections in these two institutions, but they are at pretty much every single institution. If you don't have photographic collections, then you're probably just missing them. They sit there somewhere in your institution or your archive, and they can help tell really important stories. So they are one of the most diverse and broad set of collections that exists pretty much in every heritage institution, and they can help us tell loads of different types of stories. So I'm going to start when thinking about photography by thinking about more canonical forms of photographic image making. So when some think about photography, we might look to more classic, or at least late 20th century representations of what photographic history is. And that might be a focus on representational photography or photographs of people, the things, the photographic images themselves, and the people that made them, mostly the important or professional people that made them. You can get amazing and brilliant photographic work, such as Edward Steichen's work that you see here on the left. This is John Barrymore of the infamous or famous Barrymore acting family playing Hamlet in 1923. Or you can get other amazing photographic representations, such as the more recent work by Cornelia Parker, where she took a series of close-up photographic images of the chalkboard used by Einstein that sits in the Science Museum Group collections. And she created photographic images that help us think about the materiality of photography, but also about Einstein's work. So they're called Einstein's abstracts, and if you haven't seen them, they are brilliant. But these types of photographic images have played a large role in what we think of as photographic collections in museums or national photographic collections in museums. They have played a predominant role in defining what that material is. And my time working with these photographic collections has given me the opportunity to try to think a little bit more broadly, or try to use collections such as these and others which I'm going to talk about, to think about the broad and inclusive histories of photography. And I suppose one challenge is if we focus on just images like this, then we're losing a really big part of the picture of what photography is, because it is so much more than just professional practice. Although professional practice is a really important part of the story, it is many different things beside. And in order to tell those stories, in order to connect to a really wide range of audiences, we need to try to find as many different ways to tell as many different stories as possible. That being said, I have been very lucky. I have been very privileged to get the opportunity to take care of some very canonically important photographic collections that help us tell the history of the origins of photography, or at least one set of the origins of photography. Because photography doesn't have one origin story, it has many different types of origin stories. But we can't discount people such as William Henry Fox Talbot, who was the inventor of the positive and negative process in Britain, competing process, as we'll see momentarily, to daguerreotypes and then other inventions that came after that. When I was working in Bradford, I had the privilege of helping to take care of the 5,000 plus positive and negative photographic collection of Talbot's work. These included some of his notebooks, some of his works, as well as some of his instrumental technologies, such as his mousetrap camera and his other technologies he used to make and capture these images. These are really important history objects of the history of photography. For example, in this collection, there is the lattice window image, which is the very first photographic negative on paper, and helps tell the evolution of photographic images. Equally, when I moved to the National Museum of Scotland, I have the privilege of taking care of very early photographic material, particularly relevant to Scotland and the wider Scottish area. So this is one very significant and important example of the work of Hill and Adamson, who were amazing early practitioners in the 1840s, working out of St. Andrews and representing a whole wide range of photographic practice. There's really brilliant work by the historian of photography, Luke Gartland, recently, that's connecting a lot of the work of Hill and Adamson and others in St. Andrews to much wider global practice. In this collection, though, Talbot doesn't just sit in one place. When his his granddaughter Matilda Talbot was dispersing his collections in or his kind of archive in the 1930s, much of that went to the Science Museum group, and some of it went to the National Museum of Scotland. So this, on the right-hand side, is examples of Talbot's photographic technologies, some of his cameras, his printing frames, and his measuring devices that he used to experiment, cultivate his photographic practice. So the origins of photography isn't held in one museum, it's held in many different places, and it can be told in many different ways. I've had the opportunity to also tell the story of the competing invention of photography, which is the daguerreotype. If you haven't had a chance to see a daguerreotype, they are wonderful objects to hold and to look at. They are like mirrors reflecting ourselves back, because they are quite literally mirrors. They are polished metal plates that have a direct positive onto the metal plate itself. Invented in France, popularized and used all over the continent and widely in America in the early to mid 19th century, and are a really important part of kind of commercial photography and how photography was used by a whole range of audiences in the 19th century. But you also get the weird and wonderful in terms of subjects. So what you have on the left is an example from NSMM's collection. Sorry, I say NSMM, I mean the National Science and Media Museum, so please excuse me for any short terms. And when I say NMS, I mean the National Museum of Scotland. So on the left here, you have maybe what we could call a daguerreotype, early photograph of or early daguerreotype of a dog. The fact that they were able to get this dog to sit for long enough for it to be posed and captured, I think is a bit of a miracle. What you have on the right is a daguerreotype made by the well-known American photographer Matthew Brady in the 1850s. This is of a very controversial subject, although it doesn't maybe look so. You can't see that at first instance, but research helps us tell broader stories about these kinds of people represented in these collections. This is George R. Glidden. He was a merchant and author, and also the US Vice Consul to Cairo, and did a lot of work about, essentially did a lot of very problematic work around colonization and racial classification in the mid to late 19th century. And you can, I guess, see some of that in the kind of rakish description that you see here in this daguerreotype image before you. We also have, at least when I was working at the National Science and Media Museum, a wide range of other types of material on photographs on different types of material, such as glassplate, very early glassplate photography. Some of you might recognize what the subject of this is. So this is a early glassplate photograph from 1851. This is the Crystal Palace from the Great Exhibition. Or this is the Crystal Palace of the Great Exhibition taken during the Great Exhibition. You know, it is a very important set of images. There's about 16 of these glassplate negatives that were found in a box in the National Science and Media Museum's collections, acquired and duly kept in the collections. But I think one of the really important stories that it tells is that when I first encountered these objects, they weren't on our catalog. They weren't archived. They weren't documented specifically. So for our audiences and to some of our curators coming in, such as myself, who didn't have institutional history, these were invisible. We didn't know they existed until, except for the fact that we had curators that had been there long enough to know that they existed. So some of the really important work, or I mean, one of the most important bits of critical work of the curator is being able to make sure we know that these objects are visible, that they get cataloged, they get documented, and that visitors or researchers or anyone can have access to them and be able to know that they exist in collections. Some of the work that I'm doing right now, which I can talk about later, is about connecting digital assets and collections across a whole range of museums' collections. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if anyone has any specific questions about that. Photography is also sometimes not what it looks like, or doesn't look like a photographic image at all. And trying to explain that to visitors can be difficult. So what we have here is an Autochrome image. This is one of the very early forms of color process in the late 19th century. It's very, these are natural color processes which use aniline dyes put onto potato starch grains from potatoes of the three color palette, essentially to create naturalized color. Brilliant early forms of photographic imagery that are kind of predate the commercially successful color photography that we probably know and love of the late 20th century. But these are really important scientific innovations, chemical innovations, and also important for audiences. But what this image doesn't necessarily tell is how they were used to capture people. But what it does tell you is how the actual chemical process of an autochrome works. So it helps you tell the fact that aniline dyes is actually dropped onto different bits of potato starch. So this is a microscopic image of a autochrome itself, used to then describe and explain what an autochrome is to audiences, but as a collection, is a historic object in and of itself. In the national NMS's collections in Scotland, we have a wide range of photographic collections that include amber types. So these are metal images on glass. This is a one-night plate amber type, and it's depicting two dolls. It's a really important, I think, innovation in photography. It tells a really important story about new forms of photographic practice. But this particular image also tells us a really interesting story. This is an unsigned image, ostensibly by the photographer George Rough from Brighton in 1858. But what it actually is a photograph made by his daughter, Ruthie Rough, when she was 5 1/4 years old, taking a picture of her dolls for posterity. This wouldn't have been something that was, completely free to do. So it was her father, I suppose, indulging his daughter. But it's also one of the earliest and youngest people to create a photographic image that sits within our collection. So you can get really broad and really interesting stories in photographic objects like this. And then moving a little bit later, when you move into the late 19th and early 20th century, you get the advent of tintypes. So this is an evolution of the daguerreotype metal photograph, but a lot cheaper and a lot more, I guess, democratized for a broader range of audiences. And this is where you start to get seaside photography, where you get the itinerant photographer at the beachside. And we have a great set of photographic images of tintypes, so of beachside family photographs. And you don't just get one, as I said earlier, photographs are never really in their singular, they're always in their multiple. So what we have here is a set of images that represent a family over time, them coming back year on year to the same beach, getting photographed over and over again, and changing, obviously growing, the family growing, adding new children and evolving over time. And I think, to me, this is the greatest potential of photography. We don't know anything about these sitters. We don't know who the family is. We don't know where exactly the photographs were taken. Some research might help us tell more about that. But what they do is help us remind ourselves about how important photography is to representing our own selves, our own families, and our own histories. And I think this is a great example of that. I wanted to put this in because I think places like W.W. Winter, as long-standing and one of the longest-standing portrait studios in the world, also are really important stories to tell about photographic archives and photographic collections. Because the photographic studio from the from the mid-19th century, but particularly in the 20th century, is the place that we went to represent ourselves, to capture our best sides, to create the things that we would frame and we would put up on our mantelpieces, the things that we would send to our families, or try to share a kind of representation of ourselves. So the archives that exist in these places are essential archives that help us tell a history of who we have been and who we might want to be. And Winters really isn't the only place that these kind of collections do exist, but they are rare. So another really great example in Bradford is the Bellevue Studio collection, which currently sits with the Bradford Industrial Museums and is a very large set of glassplate photography from the whole spread of the 20th century. And they tell a brilliant story of the changing demographic of Bradford. They tell a story of immigration and emigration, particularly from the Indian diaspora, particularly the northern Pakistani communities that moved to Bradford in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and came to this particular studio to represent themselves to their own families and also to send images back home. There's a really great bit of a gallery at the National Science and Media Museum which tells this story, and also a great set of collections at the Bradford Industrial Museums, just in the center of Bradford. If you haven't gone there, then please do visit. They are amazing collections. Photographs, again, are not only almost never singular, but they are always relational. They're always placed in relationship to other things that are contextual and help us tell broader stories. So I would bet that pretty much every one of us on the call here probably has a photographic album in our homes, or has an album on their phones that's probably been created by Google or something else like that. But we stitch them together. We make them into stories. We use photographs to tell the stories of ourselves or of experiences that we might have. And this is a particularly fantastic album because it is a collection of really 22 annotated albums made by the British man, Herbert Galloway Stewart, who happens to be an employee for the Grand Duchess Xenia during the Russian Revolution. So this is really the last of the Russian aristocracy displayed through a set of photographic albums and tell very familiar stories, but also familial stories of family and place and sentimentality. And if you, they are currently in the National Science and Media Museum collection, so definitely go and check these out and have been digitized and are online. Stories, so as I said early on at the start, we tend to tell the stories of photography through photographic positives, so the prints that we see on walls or the prints that we see sold through editions. But most photographs at least in the 19th and 20th century, came first in their negative format, whether that was glassplate negatives or examples such as this, which is the negative reels from the artist Tony Ray Jones, who had really important and significant work in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the collection that's held at the National Science and Media Museum tells the history of his work through his prints, but it also tells the history of his work through the edits and the cutting, the copying, the cropping that he did through his photographic negatives, essentially the work of selection, his practice of photographic decision-making. And I think, we can tell stories about a photograph by looking at what was printed and why that matters, but we're only telling a very kind of snapshot part of that. Excuse the pun. We're only telling a very small slice of that story. What we need to tell is the whole story of making and reproduction. So how photographers, how artists chose to select and what they did select and what they didn't select. And we can only really tell this through notes or through the photographic negative archive. Photographs as well are optical toys and optical devices. So this is an example of just a small set of a much larger collection of stereo images that we have at NMS. This is very early 3D photography. It ebbed and flowed over time. 3D vision was invented in the 1820s and 30s. Then they figured out how to make those into images that sold very widely, and then photographs very quickly came into play in terms of reproducing commercial sets such as this that were widely distributed and widely sold across the world, representing a whole range of scenes. From the brilliant collection that's currently at the University of Aberdeen, the George Washington Wilson collection, such as you see on the left-hand side here, through to hand-colored stereo images that are on the bottom side, at the bottom of the screen that you see here. I think it's really important to point out, though, with objects like this and with many photographic images, that you need devices. It's not just the image, but it's the device and the tools that allow you to see the full potential of these kind of images. So these are a couple of different examples of stereo viewers that were used to experience 3D vision. Some people can squint their eyes and be able to see the image in 3D, but it's really difficult. And most people need some kind of aid in order to experience what the intention of a stereo image, which is to be able to see something in 3 dimensions. I should say that one of the difficulties of actually dealing with images like stereos is that they are not accessible to everyone. Not everyone is able to see in 3D and is not able to see stereos in 3D. If you have slight astigmatism or a slight difference in terms of your pupil size or directions of your pupils, you might not be able to see in 3D. So as a museum professional, that presents a significant challenge, because if we're presenting these, we want and need to be able to make that accessible to everyone, including people with access issues. So that's something that I know that galleries such as the National Science and Media Museum, which are currently building 2 brilliant, amazing new collections galleries on their 3rd and 5th level of the museum, will be grappling with. How do you present this and address this to a wide range of users? And speaking of technologies, photography isn't just the print or isn't just the 2D material. Photography is everything that was made to produce the image in the first place. And that is a long and deep history that I know some people on the talk know way much more than I do about this. But I just wanted to put this in as an example that photographic technology, the camera technology, evolves and changes over time from a camera obscura, which you see on the top left-hand side, which is the precursor, but also a direct influence around what a camera looks like and how it's used, through to box brownies or early single reflex cameras that you see in the Nikon, or early evolutions in digital photographic image making, digital cameras. And all of these different types of camera technologies create different types of context of image production, and also how we might have taken a photograph. So, for example, a box brownie, typically you can shoot 2 different ways, either holding it down, looking at it directly below you, or looking directly through the lens. Creates very different types of images. When we're thinking about digital image making, such as Canon, this Canon digital pixel We have to think about, well, what is the storage for these kind of images? You could really probably only capture in the early period, tens to hundreds of images on a storage device before you then needed to transfer that and recycle it. So it's not, the utopia of image production that we might think of it to be. Photographic images and photographic devices also come in many different types and forms. So when we're thinking of photography, we also need to think of optical toys and optical devices that are parallel to these kinds of objects. So, for example, on the left, we have a boxed praxinoscope theater with 9 different slides. So this is about photographic spectacle. It's about early photographic movement and protofilm, being able to see images in motion in a kind of at-home theater that would have been replicated if you went to one of the big experiences in London, such as the Adelaide Gallery in the 19th century or other forms of 3D experiences. What you have in the middle is a alabaster peat egg with use of the Western Supermare from the late 19th century. So these are novelties, but they are also things that you might remind yourself of a trip down to Western Supermare. So when you look down inside of this, you see a photographic image of the area that you visited, captured for time, and being able to show and share that with a wide range of people that might have come to your house. And then going back to this weird and wonderful head that I'm very happy to talk as much as I can in the chat about, which is a experimental head from Talbot, from Talbot's collection. So Talbot was interested in a whole range of things. He was a mathematician, he was a philologist, he was a chemical experimenter, he was interested in electrical experimentation and many different things beside. And this is just one example of the kind of things that he used to play with really scientific experimentation. So, there was a static crank to connected to this head and the rod that would allow the hair to stand on end. We need lots more research around this, but it's just one great example. There's another, I think, really important point to say about photography. And that's, it tells many different stories in museums, but some of those stories are almost always invisible. So this is an example of a magic lantern set in the National Museums of Scotland that hasn't been and nor probably will ever be actually fully acquired in the museum. So this is part of an example of what the photo historian Elizabeth Edwards might call the ecosystem of photography, which means we think about all of the different ways photography plays roles in museums, from digitization through the collections, through all of the non-collections photographs that we have, such as this teaching collection that is used by some of the other departments in the National Museum of Scotland, or has been in the past, to tell stories about travel and some opportunities to teach about particularly Inuit communities. It also is a really important example of problematic language that we still have in some of these collections. So as you can see, and as an example here, both in the slide shelf as well as the image, this is an image of an Inuit woman with fairly problematic and outdated terminology used to describe these sets. And that's something we try to and need to grapple with as curators. How do we represent both the problematic aspect of these histories without making it confrontational to our audiences? Okay, so that is a quick whistle stop of some of the photographic collections that I think pose large questions for the curator. And I want to very briefly talk about an example of how I have been dealing with this in my particular research interest, which is photographic printing and photographic materials. So as I said, many photographic images are privileged for being both singular and also photochemical. But a large percentage of photography in the 19th century wasn't photochemical. It was photomechanical, and particularly in the 19th and 20th century. So this is an example of William Henry Fox Talbot, his invention of a photoglyphic printing process, which essentially means an ink-based printing process that was photorealistic. So he took a photographic positive, he transferred that onto a metal sheet, he etched it, and then he made a inked print out of this. I think this is really revolutionary because, as we'll see in a minute, it allows for a series of evolutions like photochemical innovation for different inventions to create reproducible images on mass scale. So this is a set of collections in the NSMM collections, which are analogous and parallel to the Talbot photo chemical collection. They also have some of his technologies and printing frames that he helped use to produce these images. So we can tell the larger context of how he made them and how they use them. And I have a PhD student who's currently working on that named Francesca Strabino, who's doing absolutely brilliant work. This photographic innovation led to a series of innovations that we can ascribe to the invention of the halftone. So this is the ability to print an image with very tiny dots, which allows for photomechanical images such as this. And if you zoom up closely, you can kind of see the halftone gradient in the background. And this led to really the boom and explosion of the mid and early 20th century for photomechanical printing in our newsprint. And I think it's really important to say that this kind of image, so a photographic image reproduced in print, is something not actually very well represented in museum collections, because we don't collect periodicals and books. That's what libraries do. But this is where the mass amount of photography is in the 20th and maybe 21st century. So how do we tell these stories? How do we include this? And part of the way to include this is by being inclusive and diverse. So let me briefly talk about one of those collections that can help us tell about the story of newsprint and the importance of photography to printing and newsprint in the late 19th and early 20th century. Excuse me. So the Daily Herald was a large national newspaper, started in 1911, running through to 1965 before it was purchased by the Sun, or the Murdoch Group, and became the Sun. It was a newspaper produced by the Labor Union and really was one of the largest selling newspapers in the 20th century. At the National Science and Media Museum, they have a collection of photographic positives and negatives that tell really rich stories about how this newspaper utilized, and produced photographic images for a wide range of publics. But it is a very broad collection. It is something like 3.5 million photographic images set across a whole range of containers such as this, that are run in a very specific and unique organizational structure. So it's organized by either theme, by biography, or by a geography. And this very unique organizational structure is still replicated in exactly the same order to how the photo editors of the Daily Herald newspaper used and printed from this collection. So if we could go into one particular example, let's take an example from either Scotland or Yorkshire from the geographical section of this collection. And if we take one of these down, let's say we take Yorkshire down, we can find a series of folders to do with murder in Yorkshire. And then we can find something within this that is more specific to Bradford. And a story about Miss Frances Hodgson and the Thin Man, a potential murderer. And when we open up this file folder, we see a series of photographs. This doesn't look like a photograph, but it is. It is a copy of text that was then produced for the newspaper that tells us the story about the murder in 1955 on a Bradford street corner, and what had happened, the sensational story to a broad national audience. We see a series of photographs that tell us about how the police were conducting their investigation, how they were using identification and tracking information such as fingerprints to be able to rule people in and rule people out as suspects. And you find text attached to the back that tells you about how fingerprint experts are taking the print of a male volunteer. You also find images such as this, where you can see the markup on the image. So this yellow lining around the bottom right-hand corner, which tells you where the editors wanted to crop the image. It tells you the caption that they wanted to put on the back of the image. And it also tells you what the column length that they wanted to produce this photographic image in their newspaper. So it's really rich set of stories in one set of images that are connected to a whole set of other stories from folder to folder about different interest stories for local, national, and international audiences in the mid-20th century. And then you can trace this to collections that aren't actually in the museum, but are on online databases, such as the National Newspaper Database, where you can find the actual print of copy of the Daily Herald from 1955. So you can see there was one photograph printed here, actually two. The bottom hand side, you see the rolling of the person's thumb, really grainy. Sorry, not great digitization. And you can see the cropped image on the top. And you can see that it is indeed the right column length that they had for identified in the actual archive itself. So in order to tell the stories of this really vast and deep set of collections, you need to start from the singular. You need to be able to look at each individual folders and try to trace out the stories that they tell from those different collections. So in the last part of this talk, I want to run through a recent project that I've been working with some colleagues at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, as well as at the National Science and Media Museum and at NMS here, to help open up the photographic archives. Well, starting with the Daily Herald collection and then moving on to other photographic collections and archives. So I've been working on this project called Communities and Crowds, and it is a project, Arts and Humanities Research funded project to try to bridge the gap between in-person volunteering and online volunteering. And we've started with the principle that photographic collections and archives are tell everyone's stories, and that we as institutions will never have enough resource or time to document, digitize, and catalog every single photographic collections in our museum. And we don't actually have the expertise to be able to say everything about every single photographic image. So we need to work with audiences to become the decision makers around what gets digitized and how that digitized material gets used. So we've been working with a set of volunteers from the Afro-Caribbean community in Bradford to document, inventory, rehouse, and then digitize and scan a series of photographic images from the Daily Herald archive that they chose. These group of volunteers that they chose were interesting to them. They are going through the very same photographic processes that our in-house digitization and documentation team do to create digital images. This isn't about scaling up or making mass number of images, but it's about engaging with the process and finding stories through collections as we do that. So we are working with these volunteers to become the owners of these collections, not physical or legal owners, but the owners of the stories that they tell through the actual work of making them visible to online collections. And they've been doing absolutely brilliant work. So this is one example of one of the images that the group of volunteers have digitized. There is a great audio file that goes alongside of this, which is one of our volunteers, Maureen Rowe, talking about this image and talking about what it means to her, describing how this is a very powerful statement of this woman confronting the kind of racism of Enoch Powell's time in 1968, and how proud she is walking and how confident she is walking across this space. I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to muddle her own words. Unfortunately, I can't play it for you because my sound's not working on the PowerPoint. But it is, I think, a really great opportunity to be able to engage with objects such as this, engage with stories that mean something to a whole range of audiences, and not just how they're represented through collections on our digital asset, our collections online, but is through the actual experience of working with the things and finding those stories out and becoming the researchers themselves. And that's really the goal of this project, is to work with those volunteers to then utilize tools such as the Zooniverse, which is an online citizen science platform, where in the past, these platforms have been used by researchers, academic and museum researchers, to pose a set of questions to audiences, to a wide range of audiences, about classifying images, classifying data, sometimes photographs, sometimes other data, and to do scientific research on these images or on these objects. But typically that's done from the top down. So it's not the citizen scientists or the research, the public making the choices of what the questions being asked about those images are, or the scientific questions. It's the researchers themselves. And we're trying to turn that on its head by working with the volunteers to actually define their own citizen science project from the collections that they've digitized. And we've created some new infrastructure with Zooniverse where people can start, we as volunteers and as moderators can start talking about it very early on in the process and create a community of interest and conversation around these photographic images while we're digitizing them. We're going to be launching that hopefully in the next couple of months. So please watch this space, and at the end, I'll circulate my contact details if anyone wants to know about it. I will be posting on Twitter and other things like that. So that's right in the middle of where we are. And since I've moved to the National Museum of Scotland in September, the next phase of the project is to try to replicate it in other collections. So we're about to start another photographic volunteer set of digitization work, but with a very different collection. So this is our stereo collection. This is the Haworth Looms collection, which is a very large stereo and other photographic collection at National Museum of Scotland. And we have about at least 2,000 of these stereo cards, and we're about to start working with a set of volunteers to find stories in these collections. It's going to have very different types of digitization experiences and different types of images, but we're hoping that the model for engagement and for working with these collections can be replicated. So after the end of this project, if anyone else wants to use this model, then I'm very happy to talk more about it or to share, and we will be publishing and sharing more about how we are creating this model for a wide range of audiences and museums. So that is my time. That is me talking through some of the broad issues with photography and telling you a little bit about what I think the amazing potentials and opportunities of photographic collections are. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will hand it back to Jane, and I am very happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Well, thank you, Geoff. That was amazing. Clearly, fantastic experience you've had at both the institutions you've worked in, and really had charge of just amazing collections. So looking at my screen, I don't seem to have any questions on the chat at the moment. So while we're waiting for those to come in, I'll start. We at Winters have got a sort of microcosm of some of the things that you showed. You know, we have obviously a large number of glass plate negatives. We've got film negatives. We've got cameras. All of the sort of developing trays and so on that were used. So it's kind of commercial microcosm, I suppose, in one place of what you've got, and that for me poses us a massive challenge because of the conditions. You know, do we keep them in the state that they're in now, or do we export them to somewhere, you know, like your museum, where they're kind of going to be on metal shelves and so on? So the kind of physical side of the curatorial role was something I wanted to ask you about. Presumably that's not an issue at either of places you've worked, but you will have seen that in other institutions, I guess, and shops.
I mean, I suppose the first thing I can say is it's always an issue everywhere, regardless of the size and institution. Taking care of photographic materials is a massive challenge because there isn't one type of photographic material, and there's just too much of it. There's so much material that being able to resource the right amount of time to be able to get people to rehouse them, to put them into, you know, we as national museums do things like, you know, you have the right temperature control, we have the right housing conditions, and try to make sure, you know, the goal of any museum is to keep things in perpetuity in its best conditions for as long as possible. But the reality is photography is it's mostly a chemically decomposing object. It's a thing that will change over time. And you know, every time you show it to someone and display it, you are altering its chemical surface and its chemical substance. So it's not unique to us. It's not unique to you. I suppose the challenge of being able to take care of a wide range of collections like that isn't unique. it's at every single collection. And the best thing we can do is just try to balance those needs, try to balance the need for availability and access and keeping these things versus, you know, storing them for as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. We do get a lot of people who bring in photographs that are so particularly color now that are just so faded. And one of the things that Winter spend quite a bit of time doing is restoring those and recolorizing them for people, or at least the digital copy. Anyway, we've now got a load of questions coming in. So the first one is from Michael Pritchard. How are your two institutions dealing with born digital artwork?
Thanks, Michael, and hello, lovely to see you here. I suppose the answer is very differently. The two institutions, National Science and Media Museum and National Museum of Scotland, the big work of, I think, any museum now, but particularly Nationals, is grappling with born digital artwork and born digital work in general. So I know, for example, the Science Museum Group is doing the infrastructural work. So getting things like digital asset management systems, digital preservation managers, systems in place in order to make sure our standards and their standards and replications are perfectly in order to be able to do that work. But they're still in the phase of developing and formalizing those rules before they do then wide-scale acquisition of born digital work, whether that's artwork or other forms of born digital acquisition or asset creation. National Museum Scotland has a different position where they're still developing its born digital collecting policy and its digital preservation system. We are utilizing other different types of digital preservation software as well. And interestingly, so when I've moved from NSMM to become the keeper of science and technology, also my purview has changed in terms of what I collect. So while I did have a responsibility for more flat material, photographic material when I was at Bradford, here it's much more three-dimensional materials and objects and less artworks. That sits typically in our art and design museum set of collections. So we don't yet have an answer for it. And I think a lot of museums don't have an answer for them yet. And I think we're all trying to work together to find the resource, time, and solutions to be able to do that work.
Okay, thank you. Next question then from Anne Powers. We have a large collection of glass plates taken in Thailand in the early 20th century, including of the royal family. Can you advise on the best way to preserve and curate these?
Sure. So I can give you as much advice as I can. So I think preserve and curate might be two different bits of work. So I suppose the most important thing I can say is in any preservation, the key is not just temperature, but much more importantly, humidity. So how wet the space is and control over fluctuations and relative humidity is probably the most important thing you can do. If you can keep them in not a freezing place, but in a cool place, that's also really important for stabilizing their chemical composition. I think the other easiest thing you can do to make sure they're preserved is what's a museum practice called rehousing. So putting them in sleeves or some kind of paper encasing so that they don't rub up against each other when you're putting them in a box, because the easiest damage is actually them just having friction against each other and rubbing off some of the emulsion. There's online, if you want to invest a little bit in it, there's online companies such as Pell, which are the go-to places for museum conservation grade things, but really it's all paper sleeves, you can get them. That's the easiest and most important thing to do with them, is just make sure they're not touching each other and that you don't have humidity. Curating, I suppose, is, what do you do with them? Digitizing them is great. How do you display those? How do you share them? That's a whole different story. I suppose it depends on where you want to go with them, how you want to share them. And it's completely legitimate to just share them with people that you know and love, but you can also talk to museums or collections to see if they want to know about them or share or kind of champion them in some way.
Yes, that's great. I think we have issues with our glass plate negative collection too. But one of the things we found is that even when you have very high levels of humidity, because we do have a high level in the cellar, its stability is the thing. When they do kind of acclimatized, but if you start moving them around, that's when you really get issues with the emulsion peeling off. So, yeah. Okay, next question. This is from Alan and Louise. Hi, Geoff. How do you feel about the dichotomy between preserving originals and institutions not having the space or funds to keep such, and therefore digitize and destroy or sell the originals?
So I think I don't necessarily think there's a dichotomy there, because I think, well, so I've only worked for national museums, and we don't sell. There's never any selling of images in a national museum. We can't make for profit a set of collections. But they do move between collections for sure. And there are very small examples of not necessarily destroying collections, but transferring them to other collections or to other places that make most sense. That's part of curatorial work, I suppose, is being able to rationalize what a photographic collection is and why it makes sense to an institution. But I think maybe the broader question is, how do we deal with the question of the scale of photography? And I think one of the things I've gotten used to is the fact that we'll never be able to collect the full story of photography because it's so much. We will always be losing something. We'll always be missing something. We'll always miss out on something. And we'll always not be telling the best stories. But what we can do is try our best, try to continue to work and tell the stories as effectively, keep the things that we can, and manage to amplify those stories as best as possible. So, you know, it's expensive and it's hard to do, but I think that's the work of the curator and of an institution to try to champion that as much as possible. Also, you know, being realistic. So, you know, we have to know we can't keep everything all the time. We don't have the space or capacity.
Hey, thank you. And the last question I think we've probably got time for is from Kate Horgan. As a former professional photographer, my aim is to organise but not scan my archive, both negatives and prints, and find an institutional home for them. Any tips on how to make my archive attractive to institutions in terms of how I organise it?
I don't. So I guess the answer to the most honest answer to that is making them attractive to archives is not necessarily in terms of the organization of them, so how you document them, because each institution will have their own documentation practices. The more that you know about the collection, so the more that you've cataloged them or classified them, the better, because it means that you can share that with a curator or an archivist or a person in an institution, and they can make an assessment on a better scale. But the easiest way to champion that and try to convince is just finding the right institution, finding the right place that has a mission and value that matches the stories that your collections tell. Because there's a whole range of institutions, local, national, a set of institutions that might want to be able to tell your story. So there's not just one institution that to think about, you know, the V&A or the Tate or Science Museum Group. Those might be the right places. But there might also be other places like local museums that are very interested in how people worked in a space or the kind of professional practice that they did in an area. So I would find the right institution that matches the stories that you want to tell through your collections.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think that's it as far as questions that have come in on the chat. So people are now starting to say thank you, and I would like to add my thanks to them. It's been a fantastic hour, Geoff. Thank you very much. You've given us an amazing insight into the work that you've done and the complexity of work as a curator, not just physically looking after the collection, but as you say, interpreting it, organising it, and linking it with the audience, which is hugely problematic. And you've explained brilliantly how you're doing that. And I shall very much enjoy watching how your two projects with your volunteers evolve, and hope to keep in touch with you on that. So thank you on behalf of both the WW Winter Heritage Trust and the Derbyshire Archaeological Society. We wish you well with your time at the National Museums of Scotland. I shall be coming up hopefully this year to Edinburgh, so I will look forward to seeing the collection in the gallery itself, and maybe catching up with you as well. Yeah, it's all coming Thank you for an interesting talk. Thank you, Geoff. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time. Lovely to see you all.
Okay. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.